I come to this issue of tracking climate finance from the climate policy concept known as measurement, reporting, and verification. If you are a climate policy person, you will remember at the negotiations in Bali in 2007, which at the time were instrumental in reinvigorating hope that the international community could deliver an effective climate treaty. Some of that hope has since dissipated, but one of the major factors in keeping things going was an agreement that the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change reached in sort of a quid pro quo arrangement that if mitigation actions on the part of developing countries were to become measurable, reportable, and verifiable, then so would the climate financing that developed countries were to provide to developing countries in order to support those actions and to support adaptation. So with that agreement, my organization began to look much more closely not only at some of the questions around how climate finance could be used effectively for adaptation, for technology, and for forest conservation, but also to try to track it more concretely against the pledges that have been made with regard to climate financing. So our work on finance tracking started focusing around the pledges for fast start financing that developed countries made, which Timmons also mentioned earlier, to provide financing approaching $30 billion over the years 2010 to 2012. And we wanted to find out initially simply whether countries were delivering on that collective commitment, who was committing what, who was pledging what, as well as what characteristics that financing had. So was it being allocated in a balanced manner between different objectives, including mitigation and adaptation? Could it be considered new and additional according to various baselines that one might choose? Through what institutions was it flowing, and was it targeting, if not the most vulnerable regions within countries, at least the most vulnerable countries? So we looked at what countries had pledged, what they had committed on those pledges, so whether they had undertaken action at the domestic level to make the pledged financing available to recipient countries, and then a variety of information regarding those questions that I just mentioned. So we began doing that in 2010. We've updated our database of fast start financing several times since then, and in the course of doing that, began to grapple with, I think, a lot of the same issues that the development aid community has been dealing with for a long time in terms of transparency and data availability, and tracking metrics and indicators that are meaningful to end users. So some lessons from the experience of tracking fast start financing. There are definitely challenges with regard to consistency, comparability, and the level of detail in a lot of the publicly available information on fast start financing, which tends to rely on reports by contributor countries that provide different levels of information, that define fast start financing in different ways. And so because different countries are counting different things and reporting different pieces of information about what they are counting, the ability to understand the nature of those fast start finance pledges is quite limited. And these are also issues that as we reach the end of the fast start financing period and start to think about longer term climate financing, we'll still have to deal with. So it's very encouraging to see all of the initiatives that different institutions are taking to improve tracking and reporting on climate financing specifically. And I think there's a lot of opportunity even over the next few months to improve consistency, to improve the level of detail that's provided in a way that will enable a range of end users to do more interesting things with that information. Coming out of the recent period of climate negotiations where countries have made a range of pledges on climate finance and also on mitigation actions, there has been more generally, even beyond the broad issue of climate financing, a need for improved transparency and information about the steps that countries are taking on the ground to deliver on those pledges. And with that in mind, the World Resources Institute convened a network now called the Open Climate Network that consists of about 18 different research institutions in a range of developed and developing countries who are committed to developing and implementing systematic ways for gathering and analyzing information regarding what their countries are doing to deliver on mitigation and financing pledges. So we have, I think we have representation from about 14 countries involved at the moment. You'll note on this map that most of the countries that we work with are major economies, either developed or developing countries. The reason for that is that we started this work around focusing on mitigation pledges. And so we focused on those countries that have, for the most part, the highest emissions. As we move into the finance space, there's clearly a different set of actors an overlapping, but somewhat different set of actors that we need to be working with and consulting with. So we do plan to do that. Just to give a little bit of background on the Open Climate Network in general before I go into what we're doing on climate finance. Our objective is really to provide credible information that enhances transparency and accountability for policy effectiveness and for the provision of climate finance, and to enhance that credibility and trust both between countries and also between different actors within the same country at the domestic level. And so we want to do that, first of all, by providing, by helping people access independent sources of information on delivery on these pledges. We hope to promote a positive competition between countries as they seek to undertake actions that improve their low-carbon development and competitiveness in a low-carbon economy. And finally, to facilitate the enhanced engagement of a range of stakeholders and especially civil society groups in understanding and influencing the actions that their countries are taking on climate mitigation and finance. We work in 3 areas, one of which is climate finance, and so I'll go into that in more detail. We also have a module, as I've mentioned, that looks at the implementation of mitigation policies on the ground and assesses how effective those are and what they're likely to deliver towards commitments that countries have made in the areas of low carbon growth. And then we have a third module that focuses on metrics and indicators of countries' ability to remain competitive or become competitive in a low carbon or carbon constrained world. So those are just the other angles of climate transparency and accountability that we work on. With respect to climate finance specifically, we had 3 goals in mind when we laid out our approach. And the first one was really just to be able to answer some basic questions about the pledges that contributor countries had made in terms of fast start financing and longer term financing for 2020. And those are the questions that I alluded to earlier. First of all, about how much is being provided, what channels is it flowing through, what form does it take in terms of grants, loans, how is it distributed between different objectives and different recipients, and whether it can be considered new and additional according to a range of possible definitions for that. Secondly, we wanted to help lay the groundwork for what I'm calling here life cycle accounting of climate finance. So we're really focusing on contributor country delivery of financing to meet pledges, but there is a point of intersection between that work and the type of work that Kate and Christian were describing in terms of tracking the financing in recipient countries and understanding where it's being used and what it's doing on the ground. And so we're trying to build in some information, for example, around collecting information on the institutions that will receive the financing and what the expected impacts of the financing are, just as kind of a placeholder that we hope will allow us to eventually interact with some of that other data. And then finally, to perhaps help to prompt some channeling institutions to consider measures that might improve the effectiveness of climate finance. For example, raising questions around when you're classifying a project as adaptive, has the project been done bearing in mind information from an adaptation plan or a vulnerability assessment? So have those kind of basic steps been taken or procedures been followed to ensure that identified needs are being addressed. In terms of our approach, we're still in the process of developing our methodology. It's been very educational for me to hear some more about some of the other work that's being done in this area because I certainly hope to learn from it and factor in some of the lessons. The scope that we are targeting initially is public financing that flows from developed countries to developing countries. There certainly is a much broader spectrum of climate financing that ideally could also be tracked, but we have to start somewhere. We are looking at sources of data, including the information that's reported to the OECD DAC, reports of institutions that channel climate finance, reports that countries make, for example, on their Fast Start financing, or to the UNFCCC through national communications, as well as national budgets, with a view towards identifying the information that's listed here in the column on the right so that we can answer some of those questions that I flagged earlier. I expect that it will be necessary to go down into project documents in significant detail, as some of my colleagues have a lot of experience doing, and it's certainly a very big task to be able to do that at the scale that will eventually be required. So I think that the more that we can coordinate on this work and adopt consistent approaches, the more successful we'll be in being able to provide that kind of information. So I'm looking forward to continuing that work. Thank you.